and we continue with JavaScript. And so for today's class, we'll actually continue with advanced concepts in JavaScript functions. So already we know what a function is, how to call a function, how to use a function, how to make use of parameters, arguments within a function. All of that we already know about. But here for today's class, would actually be seeing some other aspects of functions that we've not touched at all. Now, these aspects of functions we'll be seeing are actually concepts that make the entire, function as a whole very easy for you to use. And it also shows you different ways you can actually declare a function and not the other way we've done it before. So the content for today's class has been divided into two sections. So for the first section, we have the JavaScript functions continued. And this is actually going to be like a continuation of our first function class that we had. So in that class, I talked about a function, what it is, how to declare it, how to define it, how you use arguments and parameters within a function, and some of these basic things you can do with the function. Now, in this class, for the first section, we have that with JavaScript functions. And here we'll be seeing the different declaration of functions. So the previous class we had on function was mainly for just the basic declaration of a function. That's like the easiest type of declaration. But here we'll be seeing how you can declare a function as an expression. Under this part, we'll see a very brief syntax and example. We would also see the function constructor. Now, I believe we already know what a constructor is because we saw the concept of constructors within arrays and objects, where we made use of object constructors and array constructors. Now, within a function, you also have a function constructor. And so this constructor also gives you a different way to declare a function. So under this, we'll see a very brief syntax and we'll see an example. And lastly, under this section, we'll be seeing what is called an arrow function. Now, this arrow function is so important because the arrow function here is the most modern way of declaring a function. In fact, it's actually the most modern way, and it's actually the fastest way to even declare a function. I will tell you why it is so when we see the syntax. But not to worry, each of these function declaration methods are actually very easy to implement and use. They are very straightforward. And the good thing with each of them is the fact that they all require a lesser syntax than the first method we saw when we learnt about introduction to functions. So that means that function as an expression has a lesser syntax, likewise the function constructor, and also mostly the arrow function. As a matter of fact, the arrow function here even has the least amount of code within its syntax. It's so small and thereby it makes it so easy to use. So after we've gone through these function declarations, we would have a quick demo on how each of them actually work. And you know where we do that on, we'll go to VS Code and we'll try out different examples relating to these function declarations. Now for the second content of today's class, it's actually going to be focusing on invoking a function. So I believe we already know how to invoke a function in the first function class. And how to do that basically is by calling the function by its name. And of course, you would add a parenthesis at the end. And if the function is one that has parameters, you would know that you would add arguments to that function. But here we'll be seeing different ways of invoking a function. And because of this section, we'd actually be looking into JavaScript this keyword. Now there's a keyword in JavaScript called this, and this particular keyword is quite important in understanding how to invoke different types of function. So we'll be seeing the JavaScript this keyword. We would also see instances where this keyword occurs, and we would see an example of each of these instances. Now, some of these examples we might not see on the slide, but definitely when we get to the practical demo on VS Code, we'll definitely see how this keyword is being used. Now, after this, we'll talk about invoking a function as a method. And this particular section is under one of the instances of the this keyword. So we'll be looking into how to invoke a function which appears as an object method, because here it actually appears as an object method, and I would explain what that actually means. We'll also see how these methods can be reused in JavaScript. To reuse this method, we make use of the call and apply methods. So this call and apply methods, we would see an example of how they actually occur. And of course, the last part of this section is where we would have a quick demo, which will be a rundown of everything we have so far in this section. So without wasting our time, let's begin with the first section. And so the first section here begins with function as an expression. So here, a JavaScript function can be defined as an expression. So for those who don't know what an expression is, an expression basically is a block of code that evaluates to a value. So what this expression means actually is that you are going to have a block of code that will generate a particular output. Now this output is going to be stored somewhere. It could be a variable, it could be, most times it's actually a variable you store this output in. And so when you want to, print out that output, you would reference it by the variable it is assigned to. Now, very briefly, we have the syntax of how this function could appear as an expression. And from the syntax here, you can see that it begins with the function keyword, which we already know about, function. After this, we have in brackets or parentheses the parameters. We have param1, param2, and the rest dot dot here actually represents as many parameters as our function requires. Now, we also have the code here, which is within this curly braces. So obviously, you know that the code for our JavaScript function is always within curly braces, and like this is actually how the syntax appears. But funny enough, you might actually notice something in this syntax as opposed to the first time we talked about JavaScript function, because there's actually something missing here. And what is actually missing in this syntax, which is different from the normal JavaScript we already know about, is a function name. So if you notice very well here, we do not have a function name. We only have the function keyword, we have the parentheses which holds our parameters, and we have the curly braces which has our codes. The function name is not present here, and I will explain why in the next slide. So here we have an example of how a function could be an expression. And if you notice very well in this example, we begin with a variable declaration, which is the dollar sign func here, that's func, and it is declared as a constant. Now, after this declaration, we have our function being assigned to this variable name. And this is actually because of the fact that, we do not have a function name in this example, but this particular function has a name, and the name of this function here is the variable name we have here. So it's actually safe to say that the function we have here is what you would call an anonymous function. And by the word anonymous, we mean that the function here has no name. You can see it by this side. It has the function keyword, it has the parameters x1, x2, and it also has our block of code, which is returning x1 plus x2. There's no function name here in this entire syntax. So the function name for this particular method is not required. The name that will be used to reference this function would be this variable name rather than the normal function name we all know about. So this is why I said that the syntax here is actually less and is not as much as the other syntax we have here. So in the next line, we have our JavaScript outputting. Here we made use of the document.get element by id of p1 dot inner html, and you would see that to actually reference this function we made use of the variable name dollar sign $func, and this particular variable name actually holds the argument for this function. So on a normal day, peradventure we had a function name, would reference this by the function name instead of this variable name. But using the method of having a function as an expression, you would always reference your function by the variable name, and the variable name will be the one to hold the argument for that function. So here the arguments here are 4 and 6, which are integer values. Now this 4 and 6 will be passed into the function parameters x1, x2, and it will return the summation, that's the addition of the two of them. So you would have this to be return 4 plus 6, and when you run this on a code editor, you would have the output here to be 10. So this very briefly is how a function looks like as an expression. Very simple, very straightforward, lesser syntax. Although some people might not consider it very less, since the only thing that you removed here was the function name. But all the way, it is still less. Now the next one we have is the function constructor. And here a function constructor can be defined with the inbuilt function constructor in JavaScript. Now, so far so good. When we learnt about objects and arrays, we also saw methods of declaring those. And I know that we saw an object constructor and an array constructor. I believe so. So for those who do not know, you might need to check out those videos again. You will definitely see a part where we had the object constructor. So here we are dealing with the function constructor. And one thing I can notice with all these constructors is the fact that they always begin with the new keyword. That's this new here. So looking at the syntax for this particular method, you can see that it starts with new. For the object constructor, it also starts with new. For the array constructor, it also starts with new. So after this new, it is followed then by the function method. Now, this function we have here is not a keyword, because the keyword is actually in lowercase completely. Here we have the function to be in capitalized, which the F here is in capital letter as opposed to the rest of the letters. So the function here is a method and not necessarily a keyword. Now, within this method, you would have your parameters, which are going to be in string form, and you would also have your codes, which would equally be in string form. So everything here will be in string format within the parentheses, and that's how the syntax for the function constructor looks like. So here also is a brief example of the function constructor, and you can see that this particular function constructor, it also doesn't have a function name. So there's no name here. We begin with the new keyword, with the function method, and within the function method we have x1, which is a string. We also have x2, which is a string, and lastly we have our code, which is return x1 plus x2, which is also a string. So here the function has no name, and because it has no name, we would have to reference it by a variable name, which is why we assigned it to the constant declared variable, which is $func, func. And the output in here is pretty the same, nothing different. You reference this by the variable name it has been assigned to, and then you pass in your argument. We already know this. The arguments here of 4 and 6 will be passed into the parameter of x1 and x2, and therefore you would get your code executed, which would yield to 4 plus 6, giving you 10. So that's how a function constructor looks like, very briefly. Yes, so in this particular part, we have what I would consider the most important of all. It is also known as the arrow function. Now, this arrow function is actually a very modern way of creating functions, and not just in JavaScript, but even in other programming languages. They also have ways that they could actually create their own function in with making use of this arrow syntax. So first and foremost, the arrow function here is an advanced method of defining a function. Now, some people will consider this method to be the most advanced, but it would actually shock you to know that it is actually the most advanced, and it is also, me personally, I would say it is the most easiest, actually, surprisingly. Despite the fact that it is advanced, it is the most easiest way to create a function, and it is also the fastest way to create a function. Now, within this arrow function, it requires a lesser function syntax, and this actually means that it actually requires the least amount of code in its declaration. That's the lowest syntax you would use. It actually occurs here in the arrow function. And so the arrow function, unlike the rest of the functions we've seen so far, and even the very first function we saw in the first class, here the function keyword, the return keyword, and the curly braces are not needed in the syntax. So I know some of you might be wondering, wow, how is this possible? Yes, it is very, very possible. The keyword, the function keyword, the return keyword, and even the curly braces are not needed. As a matter of fact, the parenthesis is also not necessarily needed, and I will explain how that actually happens. So here we have the syntax and the example of the arrow function. And as you can see, it's very straightforward. We only have the parenthesis which holds our parameters. Here you can see them to be param1 and param2, and then there is something like an arrow that's after the parenthesis. Now this arrow is formed by a combination of the equals to sign and the greater than sign. So putting it together will give you this kind of, it will give you a kind of arrow that is pointing to your right. And so in my own understanding, I can say that it's actually pointing to the code. That's where you would have your code. That's why you see it point to this particular code here. So you can see from the syntax, there is no function name, there is no function keyword, there's no return keyword, and there's also no curly braces. So that's how fast and how easy this syntax is. And so looking at the example, we have our variable declaration. Now this variable declaration is quite important because we do not have a function name. So it's why we make use of the variable name in this instance. But mind you, if you don't want to reference this by any variable name, you can output this directly with your JavaScript outputting. That's the document.get element by ID. You can actually, you know, assign it to that for direct outputting. But here we are assigning it to a variable name and would use the variable name to output the function. So looking at this example now, you can see on the left hand side, that is from the equals to sign towards your right. You would notice that within the curly braces we have our within the parentheses we have our parameters of x1 and x2. Now after these parameters, we also have the equals to and greater than sign, which forms this arrow like symbol. And after those symbols, we have our code x1 plus x2. So here the function keyword is not needed, the return keyword is also not needed, the function name is not needed, and also the curly braces is also not needed. So I did say something about the parenthesis also not being needed, and that will be in the case whereby we have a single parameter. So peradventure we had only x1 and not x1 and x2, you can actually just put x1 there and you would remove the parenthesis out of it. So you just have this to be constant $func equals to x1, then the arrow symbol, then x1 itself. So this is how simple the arrow function is, very straightforward. And here we made use of our JavaScript outputting. That's the document.get element by ID. And this output is assigned our variable name and also the argument we want to use within this function. So like this, I can say that we've come to the end of other types of function declaration in JavaScript. And so what we have next is a quick demo on JavaScript functions so far. So for this, we'll actually be trying out all these different declarations we've seen. So let's get to it. Okay, so for this, we'd have our JS folder and I'll call this JS functions. What we have next are HTML and JavaScript. Okay, so we have all this now. So I would reference our JavaScript here to be main.js. The next thing we'll do is to create some HTML elements that would make use of. And so I would say the output of this function is this. So what I'm going to do here is that we are going to have the same operations, but we would use different declarations for these operations. So this actually means that irrespective of what declaration we use, we should actually have exactly the same result for each of them. So I'll copy this into 4 places. And so for the very first one we have here, we'll be making use of the normal function method. That's the older one we know about. So I'll give this an ID to be P1. Here would have P2, would have P3, and here would have P4. Okay, so if I should open this with the browser now, we have this on the screen, and we would actually be trying out different declarations for our operations will be performing. So back to our JS file, we'll be using the normal function method. I believe we already know how to do this, and you do this by beginning with the function keyword and you give this a function name. You also have your parentheses and also the curly braces. So here we'll pass in some arguments. I would say x1, x2, x3, and x4. So I would return x1, x2. Let's just go with something very basic. So just do an addition of you know each of these parameters. Okay, so this should return the addition of the 4 parameters we have here, and using the normal method we reference this by the function name. I would also give this the arguments. I'll make use of some even numbers for this. Next thing we do is to output this document.get member id name of p1. This would be equals to my function with the following arguments. So saving this now, we should actually have the addition of these even numbers, and you can see the addition here on the browser is 20. So this has been done with the normal function we knew about before and not the one we've seen in today's class. Okay, I guess I'll give this a space. So the next thing I'll be doing now is making use of the other function declaration. So here we have function as an expression. And so for this, we'll be making use of a variable name called this $func. And here we would have the function keyword. We would also have the parentheses for our parameters x1, x2, x3, and x4. Next, we would have a code here, which is to return x1 plus x2, x3, x4. So this is how it is when you have a function as an expression. Document.get element by id. Here I'll make use of the second id, which is p2, inner html. This will be equals to our variable name, and then we'll pass in the argument, which will also be the same. And so if I save this now, we should expect to see the same result in the next line. And you can see also that this evaluates to 20. Now for the second method we saw today, and that's the function constructor method. This method would also make use of a variable name since it doesn't have a name. And I'll call this $func1. And this is because we declared this to be a constant, so we can't assign this a value again. I believe we already know that. Here we have the new, and here we wouldn't have the keyword, rather we would have the function constructor method, and that's this. So you can see that this is in green color and this here is in blue color. So this represents two different things. Here we have the function keyword, here we have the function constructor method. So we'll also pass in our parameters x1, x2, x3, x4. And now we'll have our code return x1, x2, x3, plus a plus x4. Document dot get element by id. Here we'd use the p3 dot inner html within the parentheses would have 2468. If I save this also, we should have 20 as the result, and we equally have 20. So far so good. You can see that despite using the default function method, the function as an expression, and the function constructor, they all give us the same result. So there's nothing different here. And the last but not the least, my favorite, the arrow function. This will be func2, and this would be straight ahead. Within our parentheses, we would have x1, x2, x3, and x4. Our arrow symbol, which is a combination of the equals to sign and the greater than sign. And here we would have our code x1, x2, x3 plus x4. So you can see how short this is compared to the rest of them. Document.get element by id. We use the last id, which is p4. We'll call this by the variable name. I would also pass in argument 2468. This should give us the same result also. And now you can see that despite the method we used in declaring our function, they all evaluate to giving out the same value. So it is actually safe to say that whatever you can do with this default method we have here, you almost can do that with the rest of these methods. Probably the only thing different might be some complex kind of operations, probably things relating to using the this keyword, and also some kind of object binding with functions. But aside those, for any kind of normal operation, you can actually do it using any of these four methods. So that's how easy and how simple function declarations are. That's for the advanced types. Now I said that this particular parenthesis in the arrow function can be ignored, and it can only be ignored if you have just one parameter. So I will take out this parenthesis here, and now we have four parameters. We only need just one. So I would also remove this. Now we have one parameter that would also return one parameter too. So we don't need all these arguments here. I'll keep just one. And if I save this now, we should have an output of the number 2 on the screen. So you can see we have 2 here. That's in this particular line. And we can also decide to add the parameter. Nothing actually changes. It still gives us the same thing. still have 2 here. But then if we should ignore the parentheses and we have multiple parameters x1, x2, you have this to be x1 plus x2. We pass in here 2 and 4. You can see already we have, an error here. We have a problem right here. If I save this now, you wouldn't expect anything. You can see it even affects the rest of the results we had before. Okay, even changing this to semicolon, let's see what actually happens. Still doesn't display anything at all. So this is why the parenthesis is very important when you have more than one parameter when using the arrow function. So this should give us 6. Yeah, we have 6 now. So I'll be taking this back to the way it was before. This should give us 20. Yeah, 20. So that's that with function declaration in a nutshell. I hope now we understand that we do not only need to use the default way of declaring a function. You can actually make use of any form of declaration that is convenient for you, or that you feel is fast and quick enough for you to start with. So we'll be moving on to the next section of today's class, which is on invoking a function. So looking at just from where we finished from, you'll notice that we invoked a function either by the function name or by a variable name, and they all had arguments within themselves. But here we'll be seeing the different ways you can actually invoke a function aside from those ways that we've actually seen today. So first and foremost, before we move on to invoking a function, we would be looking at the this keyword. So in JavaScript, there is a keyword called this, THIS, and I know we've not really made use of this keyword at all. Now, in JavaScript, the this keyword actually refers to an object. Now, I said before that in one class that everything in JavaScript is an object, and that's actually true. We have the general object, which actually talks about every single thing in JavaScript. And then we also have the object data type. So do not get confused. They're actually two different things. But just know that everything in JavaScript is an object. Now, the this keyword actually refers to different objects depending on how it is invoked or how it is being used. So you can use the this keyword to refer to a particular object, that's like your actual object data structure, or you can refer to a particular global object or any kind of object including HTML elements. Yes, including that. So the this keyword here refers to all types of objects. So here very briefly are the instances where this keyword actually could occur in. Now, first and foremost, it could occur on its own. So this actually means that this keyword here would actually be on its own. That is going to be on its own within your JavaScript file. So it's not going to be within a function or an array or a method. It's just going to appear on its own. And we all know that anything that appears on its own in JavaScript mostly carries the global scope. So by global scope, that means you can actually use it anywhere in your JavaScript file. Now, the next instance where this keyword can appear is within a function. Yes, it can also appear within a function. And thirdly, it can also appear within an object method. So for those who don't know, an object method basically is a property that carries a function declaration. Now, what this means is that we already know that within an object, we have the elements of an object to be in key value pairs. And by that, we mean that you have the property name and the value that is being assigned to it. That's how the object actually appears. I know we all know that already. But here, within the object, we can have a key name or a property name that has a function declaration as its value. I know we've not done anything like that before, but it is possible to have a function being used as a value to a key name or a property name within an object. And hence, that particular kind of function is called an object method, because that function is serving as a method within that object. So no need to worry, we would definitely see what I mean by that. And lastly, we can have this keyword within an event. So I believe many of us might not know what an event is, but an event basically means a particular thing that actually occurs in your code. So events here are things that happen to HTML elements. And so this event could be something as basic as you clicking a button, you hovering over a particular button, you hovering over a particular text, the browser reloading a page. A particular thing could occur when you close or when you open a page. All those things are called events. And these events have something we call event handlers. Now, these handlers are used to handle those events, which could be regarding to the browser action or the user action. So an example of a user action is when you click on a button. You can actually have some JavaScript code that could run a particular function when you click on that button. What would make the code to run is known as the event handler. And an example of a browser action can be when you reload a page, when you load a page, when you start a page, some JavaScript functions can run on the background. Those are actually done by event handlers, which are connected with the browser actions and not user actions. So this is why I said that JavaScript is a very important piece when it comes to declaring, when it comes to creating a web page. You can actually use it to do basically any kind of event you want in your web page. So here we have the first instance, which is the this keyword on its own. And the this keyword here refers to the global object. Now, I said that everything in JavaScript is an object. So everything basically is an object. And when this particular this keyword exists on its own, it refers to the global object. So the global object actually here means the general object of all other objects. Now, I said that the object I'm talking about here is different from the object data type. So do not try to think of it as a data type. No, everything in JavaScript is an object. Even HTML itself is also an object. So the this keyword here would refer to the global object in this instance where it is on its own. And so the global object here actually represents your browser window. That's the entire screen of the browser. That's the global object. So the this keyword existing on its own would refer to the global object. So here is an example of how this could look like. And you can see that we initialized, or rather we declared a variable $obj with the let keyword, and it is assigned the this keyword itself. So here the this keyword is actually playing the role of a value. And so if we should output the variable name, that's the $obj, it would actually refer to the global object, which is the object window itself. That's our browser window in general. So that's how this actually works. So next we have the this keyword within a function. And the this keyword here refers to the global object. So even within a function, it also refers to the global object by default. That is, similar to when it was on its own. Within a function, it still refers to the global object by default. And so in the example we have here, we made use of the default form of declaration, which is with the function keyword and the function name. Within the code block, we have return this. The this here is the keyword itself. And when we output the function name, it would output, the object window. Also the same thing. Next, we have the keyword within an object, or you can say within an object method. And here in this case, the this keyword would actually refer to the object itself and not the global object. So if you look at the example closely, you would see that we have an object declaration which has the object name of person, and within the object we have some key value pairs. So you have f underscore name, which is a key name. It has the value of John. We then have l underscore name, another key name with the value of Do. And lastly, we have another key name, my underscore funk. It's a key name here, also known as the property name. And the value this particular key name has, it's a function. So this key name has a function as its value. Hence, this function is known as an object method. So this is an example of what I meant by an object method. The value for this key here is this function here. And if you notice well, the function here doesn't have a name. That's because it can be referenced by this name here. that's the property name. So for this function, we made use of the second declaration, which is as an expression, which only has the function keyword, the parentheses with parameters if necessary, and also the curly braces. So this is an example of how the this keyword can occur within an object. So if you notice well, it actually occurs within a function which is within an object, which is why I said that the this keyword within a function by default represents the global object. But if in a case you have that function within an actual object, it is actually going to refer to that particular object and not the global object. So here we have the document.write, and I use this because the space we have on the screen is limited and I would like to have every syntax on one screen. So here with the document.write, we can actually print out this object by saying person dot my underscore func with the parenthesis here. So the person here represents the actual object and the my underscore func here represents the key name. I believe we already know how to reference the key name. Very easy. You begin with the object name and you can either make use of the dot notation or the bracket notation, and that is followed by the key name itself. Now, because our key name here has the value of a function, that is the reason we have the parenthesis attached to it. So peradventure we wanted to print out John or Doe, we would have this to be person dot f underscore name with no parenthesis. But the my func actually has a function declaration as its value. Hence the parenthesis must be present here. So now that we've seen how did this keyword occurs within an object or within an object method, we now move on to invoking a function as a method. And so the example we have here is very, very brief. We have an object name of person. We also have some key value pairs, f underscore name, the value of John, l underscore name, the value of Doe. Now, looking at full underscore name, full underscore name has a function here, and this function serves as an object method. Now, if you notice well, within this function, we have the this keyword still appearing here. But here we have this to be this dot f underscore name plus with the double quotes, and we'll also concatenate that with this underscore l underscore name, and we are returning this entire statement. So what this entire statement will do is that it's going to return John with a space in between, then Doe, to return the full name of John Doe. And this is actually because, like I said before, the this keyword here within a function, it actually refers to the global object by default. But since the function is within this person object, it refers to the person object here. And because it refers to the person object here, the this keyword appearing here actually refers to everything within the person object. So this means that if we had like 10, 20, or 30 key value pairs, this keyword here actually refers to every one of them, everything combined. So in order for us to select the one we want, we would use the this keyword, and then we'll attach that with the key name we want, which is why you have this to be return this dot f underscore name. So this particular code here would return John. Like I said before, the this here, that's this keyword, it represents everything. That's the entire person object, irrespective of how many key value pairs the object has. It refers to everything. So in order to make use of the one we want, we just attach the key name here, and this will return the value of John. Here we concatenated it using the plus symbol with a space, that's this double quote here, and we'd also concatenate this with the L underscore name, which is do. So on this last line, when we have our document dot write, this would actually return the person object itself, then dot the full name, key name. The full name here represents a key name. We already know why it has the parenthesis, and that's because the full name here has a function declaration as its value. So this would return this dot first name concatenated with a space, and then this dot L name, which means last name. So this entire code here would return John Doe with a space in between. And that is how you can return a function that serves as an object method. So next we have method reuse. So looking back at what we saw in the last slide, we created a method that returns a first name and last name, but we did not reuse that method. So let's assume we had multiple first names and multiple last names. For us to do that, that's going back to this example we have here, we would need to write all these codes over and over and over again to return a different first name with a different last name. But with method reuse that we have here, you can actually reuse a particular method even with different names being declared. And so in JavaScript, an object can make use of a method belonging to another object. So this means that we can have one object that has a method, and we can also have a separate object that is making use of a method within another object. Now this can be done using any of these two methods. We have the call method and the apply method. So any of these two methods can actually allow you to reuse an object method in JavaScript. So first we have the call method, and the call method here is used to invoke an existing method within an object into another object. So what this means is that this particular method would invoke. By invoke we mean that it will call out that method within a separate object into another object entirely different from that one. So this means that multiple objects can make use of a particular object that has a method that they need in JavaScript. Yes, it is very possible. So here we have a brief example of how this can be done. And you can see in the very first object, which is dollar sign man, dollar sign man, we declared a key value pair, which is full name with a function serving as its value. And this function returns this dot f name, which is concatenated with this dot l name. Now, if you notice very well, within this particular object, we do not have a first name and a last name. We only have a full name. So mind you, this doesn't mean that we can't have a first name and a last name. We can equally have it here. But now we are not focusing on having it within this method. We are now focusing on having them within a separate object. And so within the next object we have, which is dollar sign man1, we have our first name to be John, and we have our last name, which is L underscore name, to be Doe. So this particular object has a first name and a last name. We can also have another object with its own first name and last name. You can have multiple objects, multiple, as many as you want, with different first name and last name. So now to connect each of those objects to this particular object here that has this method that we need, which would concatenate the first name and last name together, you would actually do this by calling out the object name first. So you can see that in the syntax below the document or right, we have the dollar sign man. That's for the object name we want to make use of, and it is followed by the particular key name, which is full underscore name. And here we'll make use of the call method. You can see it has a dot notation and it is attached the call method here. Now within that call method, we are going to have our object name. That is the object name that needs that method, not the one giving out the method, the one that requires the method. So going over this again, there's an object name that possesses that method and can give it out. There is one that doesn't possess it and it needs that method. So you'd start by calling the method name that possesses it, which is dollar sign man. You would also call the particular object method you want to make use of, and we all know that in order to reference that, we would reference it by the key name, which is full underscore name, and then we'll make use of the call method itself, and then we would add the object that needs that method. So that's how you can actually reuse a particular method over and over and over again within, you know, different objects. Next, we have the apply method, and the apply method here is very similar to the call method. In fact, they're actually more or less the same. And this method here can also be used to invoke an existing method within an object into another object. Now, looking at this example, you will notice that it isn't very different from the example we saw under the call method. They are exactly the same thing. The only difference here is just that on this last line, we have this to be dot apply instead of dot call. So you can see that here we have exactly the same, syntax, except for the method itself. Now, where these two methods actually have their differences is actually, with respect to how they have the arguments within their syntax. So if you notice very well, we did not make use of any kind of, parameters here. But then when we get to the demo section, we would see how parameters and arguments actually make each of these methods, look different, despite the fact that they appear to be the same. So we've come to the end of the slide, and now we'll be looking at, invoking the functions so far on VS Code. So we are back here to our VS Code. We'll be diving into the next section, which is about invoking a function. So we begin with the first way to do this, and we talked about the this keyword, that's the THIS keyword. So I said that this keyword actually occurs in different, you know, instances, and for the first instance we have that to be on its own. So without wasting time, give this a variable name, and this would have the this keyword. So here it serves as, you know, the value. This will be document.get element by id. We'll give this an id of p5, which we do not have yet. This will be p5, p6, p7, and p8. So from p5 we would have this to be the this keyword on its own. Here we would have the this keyword. This will be within a function, and I know we did not see the this keyword within an event, but we'll definitely see that in this demo. So here we would have the this keyword, and here it would be within an object, or you might call this an object method. If I save this now, we should have, okay, we have this on the screen. So I guess we don't need these ones anymore. We don't need any of this. Okay, so we have the this keyword on its own within a function and within an object. So when you have the this keyword on its own, it refers to the global object, and this is what we mean. So going back to our browser now, you can see this, it has the value of object window. And so this object window here refers to the global object. And the global object in this context refers to the entire browser window. That's this entire screen we are seeing, everything we have here. It refers to them, everything, the entire browser window, everything we can see on this screen. That's what this keyword refers to here. And that's why I said that everything in JavaScript is an object. So the next one we have is within a function. So for this we have a function to return this. Now we'll call this by function name. p6 inner html dollar sign. Okay, this is the dollar sign, it's just my. And so for this one, it also refers to the object window. And that was why I said that this keyword on its own and within a function, they both refer to the entire browser window we can see now. But now if we were to have the this keyword within an object, this will be within an object. So we'll create our object name. I'll call this, we'll have some key value pairs, nothing, nothing serious. Assign name 1 to have the value of John Doe. Name 2 to be Jane Doe. We can say assign total. That's everybody together, and this here would have function. This will return. Okay, so it's kind of omitted the comma here. This will return this. Now we have a this within a function that is within an object. So to reference this now, document.get element by id. Here we would have p7 dot inner html, and we begin by referencing this with the object name of $people. Using the dot notation, we would have $total, and because the total is referring to a function, we'll also have the curly braces. I mean, not the curly braces, the parentheses. So you can see that here we have object, and not object window. So this object we have here refers to the $people object itself and not the global object. And I said we can actually, reference the other keys we have within the object. $name1. This gives us John Doe. But referencing this by the $total to return the entire object in general, which is why you have object, that's the object here in capitalize. Have it here. Object here represents the person. The two object window we have here represents the entire window of the browser. So the next thing we'll be seeing now would be how we can actually invoke a method. Okay, so before I go on, I know we didn't see it in regards to events. So let's quickly see that. So I'll go back to our HTML, and here we'll be having this within our HTML file. So I'll make use of the button element, and here we would have our event, which is going to be an on-click event. So this event would affect this button when we click on it. And here we would reference the entire button by using making use of the this keyword. So this particular this we have here represents this entire button like this. So this is one of the ways JavaScript can actually affect your web page directly. So this would be this dot style dot display. So we want it to affect the display property. You know what the display property is in CSS. And then we'll give this dot no equals to none. So what this would do is that by default, the button HTML element has the display which is not none. And so I'll within this button we'll have click to hide. So we have this now. So this is how a button looks like. And you can see now we are hovering over it, nothing has happened. The moment I click this, it actually hides it. And so that's one of the ways that JavaScript can actually affect your web page directly. Now, I know we've not talked about events or even event handlers, but this is just a simple way of how events work. You declare the particular event you want to affect. Here we are affecting the on click event. So this event is actually with respect to user's action. And the user action I just performed was clicking on this button. So when we click on this button, it affects the display and it sets the display to none. And you know that when the display is none, it actually becomes hidden. So if I should click again, it hides it. So that's how the this keyword works with respect to events. So now back to invoking a function as a method. I'll be making use of this example again. So here we have this to be people one. So this will be John Doe, this will be Jane Doe, and would actually return a concatenation of both of them to be this dot dollar sign name too. So this will return John Doe. Okay, let's just say and Jane Doe. This will return John Doe and Jane Doe. And we'll have this on the ID name with P8. Okay, we don't have that here. This would be P. I will have nothing here. So if I should save this JavaScript file, we should have this to be John Doe and Jane Doe. So you can see that we've actually referenced the key names within our object by making use of the object method, particularly the this keyword within our object method. So I said that in the event whereby you want to probably reference multiple first name and last name. So I'll just change this to f underscore name. F underscore name. This will be John. Here we'll have this to be Doe. Okay, so here we should have John Doe. Okay, we have John and Doe. Okay, I don't think we need the and anymore. This should just be John Doe. So we have a first name and a last name. Now, in order to reference multiple first name and last name, we would have to duplicate this entire code like this. But by making use of the method reuse method, we don't need to do that. So all we need to do is to define it this way. And here we would have another object. So I'll call this name1. This name1 here would have $f underscore name to be equals to Jane, a string. Okay, so I'm guessing it's getting affected by this. Oh, okay, we have the equals to symbol. It's not here. Yeah. Okay, so we have the F name. Here we have Jane. And for our last name, we have that to be Doe. We have Jane Doe here. Let's just have multiple names to be name 2. Here we would have name 3. John Doe, Jane Doe, have Jonathan Doe, have Mary Doe. So now we have 3 first names and last names. So these 3 first names and last names, they would all be making use of this particular object method we have here. And in order to do that, very simple, document.get element by id. Here we'll be making use of 3 IDs. So we'll have this in 3 places: P8, P9, P10, P11. So here we have P9, but inner HTML. This would be equals to, you know what we'll begin with at first? We first begin with the particular object name, which is $people, then dot the object method we want to make use of, which is total dot call. Make use of the call method, and within this we'll have the object that requires that method, which is $name1. So now if I save this, we should have, okay, we have object. Okay, so did we do anything wrong here?
I think it's supposed to be 51.
Okay, so this references to this. So quite odd. Okay, yeah, people one, not people. Thank you. So this should give us, yeah, Jane Doe. Okay, thanks very much. That was quite catchy. I didn't notice that quickly. So I'll just duplicate this to print multiple names. And here we would have P10 and P11. And each of these will have name 1. For the next one, we'll have name 2. And for the next one, we have name 3. So all of this would make use of this method we have here, and they will all have their first name to be concatenated with the last name. And so you have this to be John Doe, Jane Doe, Jonathan Doe, Mary Doe. Very simple. We can also change the call method to apply since the syntax is exactly the same. This should give us the same result. Save this and let me just change this to something else. Here we should also have the same answer, you know, we have the same results, first names and last names being concatenated together. So I said the only difference between the apply and the call method is with respect to how they make use of arguments and parameters. So for the apply method, which is the current one we have here, let's assume we want to add a particular parameter here. So I would say John John Doe plus to be is, then I will add this to age. So this will be his age. Concatenate this with years old from, concatenate this with country. Yeah. So this way we can actually make use of parameters and arguments. So here we have this age and country, you know, parameters. And so here where we have this, the name here, the parameters here would be in an array. So inside this array we would have 44. We would have the name of the country, which is a string. Let's say Nigeria. And I'm guessing we'd also have the parameters within this parenthesis in the functions. Age, $sign country, since we are passing it into this function. So we have this to be Jonathan Kent is 44 years old from Nigeria. Okay, I don't like the way this is rendered. We need to give this space. And now if you notice very well, Jane Doe is 44 years from Nigeria. Now this only works for Jane Doe, and for the rest of them we have this to be undefined, undefined, undefined. So this is actually because we did not add some arguments to each of these, you know, to each of these first names and last name, each of their objects. The object rendering this doesn't have a parameter of age and country. Likewise, this too also. So I will do that right now. Here we have a list. Now say 30 Australia. Remember the parameters here when making use of the apply method must be I mean, the arguments here must be in an array with 29 Kenya. So what I'll do for this first one is to give it the age here. Country. So this should actually work fine with the rest of them. Okay, so we all have Jonathan Kent is 30 years old from Australia. Mary Wayne is 29 years old from Kenya. So we only have issues with the very first one, which is the source of the method we are using. And I'm guessing that is because in order to make use of these ones we have here, you have to reference them by the this dot age and this dot country. But because here we are referencing it by just age and country, which the rest of the others are using, we can't do that. So this means that you either have this printed for these guys here or for only this guy. So I think I'll sacrifice one for three and we'll lose this. So this would actually remain undefined unfortunately, and the rest of them will actually print out. So we'll just comment this. So we have this to be John Doe, Jonathan Kent, and Martha Wayne with their respective ages and the country they come from. So that's how you can actually make use of parameters and arguments when using the apply method. So imagine using the call method now. If we were to use the call method here, so this would actually mean that we wouldn't have this to be in arrays anymore. So I'll take out these arrays, and now we should have the same result. We still have the same result for the three of them. So this is where the difference actually is between the apply and call method with respect to how they arrange the parameters and arguments within their syntax. So for the call method, you don't need an array. You separate them by commas and they must follow the order at which they appear in the code. So you can see that age, $age here comes before $country. So let's assume we had this to be Nigeria, and here we had this to be 24. This would actually give to us he is from Nigeria, years old, from 24. So this is why the arrangement of parameters and arguments are very important. You must put it in the order at which they appear in your code. So here, this underscore f underscore name, this underscore last name, age, and country is how we have the entire code to appear. So I think we can call it a day now. So Now we've seen some advanced, you know, concepts within functions. I wouldn't say that this is everything still. There are still one or two things still advanced in function that we've not done, but at least we have now moved a lot further from a beginner's perspective. So, thank you.